in this paper I'm going to turn the microphone on, and I'm looking at some kind of intersection between the development in contemporary painting that's taken over a century to get to, and some kind of convergence with strategies around urban redesign, things that are going on in design, and where painting and design meet in some ways. So you'll be able to tell by the paper that my main focus is from painting, which is my background. I'm a practicing artist working in an area that I call expanded painting. So that'll be the major area of focus from the time I spend in the paper. Okay. The broad history of painting has involved several radical morphological shifts, exemplified by a passage from primitive cave painting through medieval church painting to modern easel painting up to contemporary expanded painting, and through each age the shedding of one aspect of painting in the form of shamanism, spirituality, portability, etc. has resulted in a shift from sacred static images towards profane ephemeral events. The drive to get beyond the image-based nature of painting begins in the first decades of the 20th century, when avant-garde artists become as concerned with the form of the work as they are with its contents. Aspects of representation that might have been confined to the flatness of an illusory surface are detached as general principles and applied to concrete materials and situations, resulting in the conceptual deconstruction of painting and its tendency towards installational, object-based works. To show this as part of a drive towards expanded painting, I'm going to slice through art history at a different angle, using known events to arrive at a different view of painting as it exists in the contemporary megalopolis, the hyper-urban environment. The first sign of the shift from easel painting to something else begins with Picasso's Cubist work and Duchamp's ready-mades. Cubist artists developed physical extensions out from the painted surface, which became known as collage, papier-collé, and cubist constructions. Consequently, works made from cardboard and string like this one, Picasso's Guitar of 1912, appear to be a spatialised extension of cubist paintings that simply discards any need for canvas, paint, and a flat rectangular background. So I'm arguing that a push begins in painting in this particular point, results in a rendezvous with street art in the early 21st century and co-design or urban redesign. Duchamp's ready-mades appear as in the same Parisian avant-garde scene in 1913 as something of a response to Picasso's synthetic cubist works, where the traditional materials of painting are replaced by objects of mass production such as newspaper clippings, printed fabric, wallpaper, and even rope. In his most famous work from that time, this one on the left, Still Life with Chair Caning, Picasso bordered the oval painting with thick maritime rope. Concentrating on these extramural objects populating the surface and perimeter of the painting, it does not seem an enormous step for Duchamp to go from a rope to a bicycle wheel as he does in his first ready-made in the bottom right. While many artists took the innovations of Cubism to the direction of pure painting or abstraction, Duchamp opted for an ambiguous abandonment of painting that continued to pose questions for painting. So by abandoning painting, Duchamp is not affirming that painting is dead as a discipline, not even that it is dead for him as a personal interest. Whether painting has a future as something yet to come, something not yet happening, is the very question incubating somewhere inside the ready-made. The ready-made is not painting because there is nothing of painting in it. No paint, canvas, image, surface or frame. Yet the ready-made might almost have been a painting, a possible painting, since it was conceived by a painter in the context of avant-garde painting as a way of saying something about painting. Some 50 years after Duchamp's first ready-made, an entire generation of artists took up a renewed attack on painting. The result in the 1960s was an enormous migration away from the craft of painting into new practices defined negatively in relation to the medium of painting. In fact, all the major artists of that particular time, Ian Byrne, Donald Judd and Robert Smithson, who came to prominence in conceptual art and minimal art, followed in the steps of Duchamp in that they trained as painters and then abandoned painting for the sake of establishing new frontiers. However, in all their work, some trace of painting remains, some indeterminacy between painting and not painting. For Byrne and Judd, it was an unbroken interest in colour and the continuing presence of quadrilateral easel-like forms. For Smithson, it was liquefied forms and the ambiguous reflected images provided by mirrors that was reminiscent of painted illusions on canvas. By the late 1970s, painting was long forgotten, and it was sculpture's turn to be measured against the historical requirements of the day. Ironically, it is out of the demise of sculpture and its rebirth as expanded sculpture that a new practice and discourse for painting is possible. Writing in 1979 in her seminal essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, Rosalind Krauss noted that rather surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Narrow corridors with TV monitors at the ends, large photographs documenting country hikes, mirrors placed at strange angles in ordinary rooms, temporary lines cut into the floor of the desert, unquote. In the 60s, with the development of conceptual and minimal practices of land art, mark sites and axiomatic structures, artists, none of them really sculptors, were beginning to explore the boundaries of sculpture's negatively defined condition. As Krauss put it, modernist sculpture equals landscape. It equals not landscape, not architecture. So, by problematizing negativity, these artists incorporated the positive terms, landscape and architecture, into new permutations of practice. Krauss characterized this as a movement out of the purity of modernism into the plurality of postmodernism. I'm quoting her again. For within the situation of postmodernism, practice is not defined in relationship to a given medium, sculpture in this case, but rather in relation to a set of cultural terms for which any medium, photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, or sculpture itself might be used. So this condition is epitomized by the expanded field, and the expanded field is the tool we've all borrowed from Krauss ever since, that replaces any literal notion of matter or material. Thus, sculpture is not to be de-essentialized in terms of marble or steel, and impliedly neither could painting be essentialized in terms of paint or flatness. Krauss was able to say sculpture advanced by incorporating not sculpture, that is, landscape and architecture. It was this almost perverse combination of sculpture and not sculpture that defined the important sculptural work of the 1970s. Similarly, since that time, it has been the almost perverse combination of painting and its opposite, not painting, that has seen the discipline test its own limits, becoming infinitely malleable, to be self-differing and separating off from itself in search of other ways of being itself. In the 80s, painters once again withdrew from their craft training for the sake of a new kind of practice, initially known as neo-conceptualism, but eventually dubbed installation art. Site specificity was an essential element of installation art, since it revealed the physical and political aspects of the place of exhibition. This was contrasted to traditional easel painting, which could be hung in any white cube gallery, regardless of its geopolitical situation. Site specificity was a form of institutional critique that exposed an apparent bias of galleries and museums in favour of portable, quietistic works. Site poses the concrete materiality of place against the ephemeral virtuality of the painted image. By the early 1990s, artists like Guillaume Weil, Ilya Kabakov, Yanis Kanellis, Wolfgang Lade, Ned Cranston, Jenny Holzer, Damien Hirst, Ange Leccia, Sherry Levine, Mike Kelly, Katie Noland, Hani Amanius, and Jessica Stockholder, and we see Kabakov on the left and Stockholder on the right, were producing work that was object-based, environmental, time-based, multimedia, interactive, participatory. All of these elements that are not yet a definition of installation art are posed negatively in relation to the formal aspects of painting, namely static, flat, image-based, timeless, silent, and a one-way form of communication. Since most of the antecedents of installation art were based on the dialectical tension between the image and object nature of painting, and since most of the practitioners of installation art have been painters facing the impossibility of painting, the term installation art simply functions as a red herring or misnomer for a kind of expanded painting. Installation art, like conceptual art and the ready-made, are constructed out of a negative relationship with painting, opposing physical form, flatness, pictoriality, with what Proust terms a post-medium condition, where art is no longer confined by the material properties of a merely physical object-like support, unquote from her. Installation art attains a post-medium condition as an inverse logic structured on the ontological absence of painting. In the current decade, artists enter the professional field of painting where not painting is their starting point. Whatever is done from there is determined by relational movements away from painting. Consequently, artists like David Batchelor, the stacked work going up, and Jim Lambie, the floor work, who abandon painting for a rainbow alliance of media and skills, ultimately move along the same path, away from concerns for a flat image towards object and time-based practices. In this way, expanded painting could just keep expanding and become a kind of total painting, an absorption and synthesis of all the arts under painting, quoting Stephen Melville there. And it's in this kind of total expansion of painting that it eventually meets the street. Total painting would also include a kind of painting that moves out of the gallery into the street, occupying the urban environment in various forms. Expanded painting as a totalising practice synthesises fine art disciplines including painting, sculpture, installation, performance, video art, as well as multimodal design practices such as graphics, fashion, interior design, scenography, and so on. As such, it is too large to be contained by traditional institutions, and any notion of an expanded field must include a move beyond the gallery, while not entirely abandoning it, but connecting it with the world outside in a merger of art and life. Consequently, expanded painting spills out into the street and any open space in the urban environment. There, fine art practices overlap with a rich history of street culture and urban intervention, where consumer items, objects of everyday use, mass production techniques and communal interaction become primary tools of action. The story of painting as it shifts from the multimodality of expanded painting is paralleled by the transformation of the shape of human settlement, evolving from village to city to metropolis to megalopolis. These new spaces of dwelling are negotiated by the flaneur and the situationist, who rework the city as raw material, reshaping private and public domains into a jigsaw of subcultural zones. Charles Baudelaire developed the term flaneur to describe a modern city dweller as a person who walks the city to experience it in its infinite variation, and in doing so creates the city in the very action of strolling, gazing, lounging, sauntering, consuming. Walter Benjamin extended this discussion by showing that the new arcades of burgeoning capitalist cities were interior consumerist spaces that simulated the openness of the street. In time, arcades evolved to contemporary shopping malls, and the flaneur became a bricoleur, a compositor of media images and consumerist experiences. Guy Debord inherited these ideas in the midst of post-war wealth and conformism, and reacted with a radical remapping of the city in the form of drifting and psychogeography. Modern instrumental thinking had represented the city as a kind of linear spectacle, a pure functionality solely subservient to capitalism's demand for efficiency. Debord created, in opposition to this, a rhetorical map-making process that avoided passive picturing in favour of critically constructed events. Drifting was devised by Debord as a method for bringing critical consciousness to the act of perambulation. Most urban dwellers passed from home to work and back again as if in a trance, unaware of the details of techno-capitalism inscribed in their environment. Psychogeography facilitates an emotional reading of the city as the drifter wanders in a state of attunement within the terrain. Drifting was to be a kind of organised spontaneity that took the drifter from park to boulevard to bar to freeway overpass and any zone that somehow called the drifter onwards towards psychical escape away from the city's demand for functionality. Drifting rewrote the city away from the capitalist spectacle towards dynamic, intersecting relations that would be called by the situationists constructed situations. More recent urban hybrids fueled by relational aesthetics and the Occupy movement have created communities of sense that reconstitute the city life as a form of contemporary activism. Relational aesthetics, coined by the curator Nicolas Bourriaud, is defined as, quoting him, a set of artistic practices which take as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context, rather than an independent and private space, unquote. Thus, relational artists avoid commodifiable art forms in favour of situations that involve people meeting as social members of a community rather than private consumers of alienated aesthetic experiences. For example, in Roderick Tirovanidz's Pad Thai, 1991-96, the work was produced by cooking meals for gallery visitors. The idea is paralleled by a design movement known variously as co-design, participatory design, or peer-to-peer urbanism, where the designer empowers the client to step out of their passive role and participate in the design process, usually for local community-based advantage. The recent Occupy movement, which focused on the unfair distribution of wealth in the wake of the global financial crises, produced a series of aesthetic side effects relating to cooperative behaviour and communication that link it to situationism and community co-design. The slogan, "We are the 99%, add Buster graphics," the mode and structure of cooperative encampments, and technology-free forms of hand signals and voice communication demonstrate a high level of visual and aesthetic thinking in service to socially activist outcomes. These ideas and outcomes justify practice-led design research that looks at curing various forms of social dysfunction through what is known as socially useful design or design for society. In my own activities working for the Designing Out Crime Centre at the University of Technology in Sydney, I've used the street as an alternative space for exhibitions designed as constructed situations. The primary goal of these events is to reactivate dormant laneways in the inner city area and make them alive with art, light, and busyness in a synergy that makes dark, dangerous places into sites of cultural exchange and local ownership. The streets become a canvas, a site, a structure where colour can shine out, literally as pigmentation and fluorescence, and symbolically as the flavour of local talent in situ. When painting breaks its own historical boundaries as described here, it also leaves behind established modes of practice and terms of discourse. It demands a new talk to match its walk, something beyond aesthetics, beyond our usual understanding of subjects and objects, a post-aesthetics. The discipline of aesthetics often includes discussions of reality, knowledge, experience, and being. If reality is to be defined by a subject who captures a world in their sensual experience, then aesthetics provides the language for dealing with it in terms of beauty, taste, and pleasure. Ultimately, quote, any object can be experienced aesthetically. No object is inherently unaesthetic. Thus, modern aesthetics is a lens through which all experience is sensed and judged. Every experience exists on an aesthetic scale. Aesthetics is no longer a theory of art, but a model of how an experiencing subject engages with a world and gives it meaning and value. New disciplines like art theory and cultural theory spring from a desire to overcome this kind of sheer aesthetic mindedness and get closer to cultural constructions and concrete events. In previous ages, art had defined a world by setting the limits between people, communities, nature, and the gods. Modern aesthetics lessen the potentiality of art by reducing it to a mere private sensory experience. In post-aesthetics, subjectivity and beauty are no longer dominant terms, since the subjective aestheticization of experience is shifted in favour of the poetic revelation of material being. Post-aesthetics is an aesthetic discourse appropriate to a new kind of work that generates an ontological question about how something is in being. Expanded painting is painting in a post-medium condition, since it is now interfaced with sculpture, installation, video, performance, new media, and so on. In Catherine Gross's Untitled 2003, the work is made by spray painting mounds of dirt and various objects, including the walls and architectural fittings of galleries, museums, and public buildings. So I'm trying to talk about these expanded works in a post-aesthetic discourse. Painting in its traditional form has receded so that colour in an informal state can be loosed on the environment. As the form of painting recedes, the essence of contemporary synthetic colour advances. Similarly, as the usual form of exhibition display is rejected, so the conventions of exhibition etiquette are exposed and inverted, particularly around the notion of wallness. Usually our viewer is not interested in the wall itself, but rather what is hanging on the wall, what the wall can facilitate without making itself felt. The wall by its very nature withdraws in favour of a hanging. By spray painting directly on the wall, as Gross does, the wall is made to advance out of its background obscurity into an uncanny presence, standing there wounded, decorated and dramatised. The wall now reveals a world by showing the hidden work it does. The wall works as a facilitator of the art of viewing in a gallery environment. It also performs the architectural labour of holding up a building and does the infrastructural work of delivering light, warmth and spaciousness. The wall has been earthed so that its hidden materiality appears as the support on which the worldly conventions of exhibition hang. For a moment, wallness is revealed and becomes articulated visually and conceptually before withdrawing back into an integrated environment. Interestingly, her work resembles graffiti and comes from a similar production mode as street art, produced by spraying paint directly onto a wall or building and interrupting the civic authority of public buildings and of transgressive mark-making. So to conclude, expanded painting like Gross's undergoes the framework by which we have understood painting so that another painting can take place. Post-aesthetics reconfigures the framework of aesthetics so that a new thinking about art can be articulated. If aesthetics once provided a method of judging good and bad art, can we ask post-aesthetics, as a kind of ontological aesthetics, to make a judgment about the kind of presence an artwork establishes or reveals? The new situation of contemporary art overcomes the subjective bias of modern philosophical aesthetics in favour of an existential relationship to things and their mode of communal presence in the world. As a result, contemporary expanded painting is shown to be a radical revision of art, a movement of ontological presencing favouring spatial environments and temporal events that reveal what is, what matters, and where it happens in a contemporary techno-scientific age. Where it happens is not confined by the artist's studio, a fine art gallery or museum, but must also include the streets and laneways of the urban environment and beyond. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexandre Avdulov, and I am happy to be here in Istanbul, not only because I flew here from Canada, but also because it feels right to have one foot in Asia and one foot in Europe. I was born and educated in Moscow, Russia. That's where I learned my Japanese language. Then I traveled to Japan, where I lived and studied and worked and taught for 10 years. And now I live in Canada and teach Japanese language and culture to the international students. Yesterday I was walking one of the streets and stepped into a store. And a young man in the store asked me, "Where are you from?" Normal question. I said, "I am from Canada." "Toronto," he said. I said, "No, east of." He said, "Quebec." I said, "No, Easter." And he said, "Are you from Russia or something?" I walked out of this shop, 5 steps in the street. I hear a boy screaming, "Nandayo, nanishiteru Oji-san," looking at the window. And it didn't sound like Turkish to me. And I knew exactly what it was. It was Japanese. And I turned to the same man and said, "What language was that?" He said, "I don't know. his mother is Japanese and his father is from Turkey, so I said that was Japanese. So I knew I was in the right place. Today I will speak about Japanese tea ceremony, or Chanryu, commonly known as Japanese tea ceremony, which I'm working now, well, I've been practicing it for approximately 20 years and learning, teaching, and at the moment I'm trying to create some sort of methodology that based on tea pedagogy and in the framework of contemplative studies and methodology for other areas. Chanryu, commonly known as the Japanese tea ceremony, is an interdisciplinary complex which is a synthesis of arts, crafts, and multiple cultural elements brought together in a creative ritual of preparing, making, and sharing a bowl of tea. It is a contemplative practice which nurtures unified awareness through the refinement of all six senses in harmony and tranquility. It can be called meditation in motion, but unlike many other meditative practices, tea happens without detachment from, but in the real world with its colors, tastes, sounds, fragrances, and textures. Chanryu combines calligraphy, architecture, garden design, flowers, incense, and fine cuisine with ceramic, wood, lacquer, paper, metal, and fabric design and craft, and provides a framework for all of these different arts and crafts to coexist in a complete self-enclosed system. It epitomizes the Japanese penchant to elevate ordinary activities and objects to the level of art. While tea procedures are highly efficient and systematized, once mastered, their efficiency is fully reapplicable to daily life. Interestingly, following the rigid form actually results in the development of one's creativity and freedom. If we look at the characters used in Japanese language to make up the word human being, ningen, first character, nin, is for a person, and the second one, gen, is for space or interval between. This combination suggests that one becomes truly human through the interaction with the other. Chanryu offers this very opportunity of a delicate communication. Ma, another reading for a second character, is a Japanese word for space between, meaningful pause, sometimes translated as a negative space. In tea, it refers to both space and time, and fosters simultaneous awareness of form and non-form. It derives from the intensification of visual and oral attention. Ma takes place in the imagination of a human being experiencing tea. Spatial and oral silence in Chanryu brings its participants closer to emptiness or nothingness, which in tea turns into everythingness. Senno Tanaka calls tea experience Shichu no Sankyo. While being in the city, one should feel like they are in a hut deep in the mountains. Tea offers ways of creating a different reality by providing a mindful corner where one can take a short rest before continuing one's busy life. Tea offers a perfect escape from cityscapes by stopping one's mind and creating an opportunity to discover mindful corners within. It is as if it has offered a different lens through which the same world looks more sensible, and I can become one with the world and cultivate attentive awareness of the reality of things. Attention is paid to every detail, and while more imperfections are noticed as well, details and slightest changes in nature are comforting and reassuring. One learns to pay careful attention to the seasons and their flow, practically daily changes in landscape, smells, sounds, as well change of light, depending on the time of day and the season. In tea, one can actually frame the reality. So this frame itself becomes an escape, a retreat, if only for a moment. With years of practice, one cultivates practically panoramic awareness of the world, within and without. Chan Yu is said to be meditation in motion. Inner silence or tranquility is not just a separate quality, but the state of mind that is the ultimate goal, which is gradually built during daily practice over a lifetime. It is a result of rigorous training and could be characterized as a dynamic, active silence. This silence encourages listening and mindful being. Silence in tea is not an absence of sound, but rather as a presence of mindfulness. After the full tea gathering, chaji, it is suggested that the host, chaji takes approximately 4 hours. After the chaji, it's suggested that the host returns back to the tea room and contemplates in silence, reflecting on the built-up energy. Japanese tea masters, or chaji, from the 16th century onward, can be considered the first designers, since they didn't actually make the utensils for preparing tea with their own hands. They didn't make tea bowls or tea scoops. Either they found objects that could be used in tea, or found people who were able to make them according to their specifications. The best known example of the latter is seen in the creation of the first raku tea bowl in the 16th century. Rikyu, 1520-1590, the founder of the tea ceremony as we know it, searched out a Korean roof tile maker who made the first raku bowls in his presence and with his active participation. The tea bowl was produced and designed by Rikyu. It has also received a name. All tea utensils are products of co-creation between a tea master and a craftsman. Through the analysis of konomimono, or favored objects of tea masters which have survived to the present, we can clearly see how certain forms once mastered have been preserved and passed down through generations of craftsmen, becoming examples of what could be called universal design today. The designs of Rikyu in lacquer, ceramics, and metal, to name a few, are still being produced by the same families of the craftsmen 16 and 17 generations later. The current heads of the craft families continue to produce the designs of the 2nd to 15th generation tea masters while making new ones to the design of the current 16th generation tea master. In other instances, objects for tea were found, originally made for completely different purposes. They were selected by the masters of tea and brought into tea. Mitate, an ability to see and select objects, is a result of rigorous training of the eye and mind of the person of tea over many years. The creation of a toriawase, an assemblage of myriad objects for one tea, lies in the heart of Chanyu practice. The word is a combination of two verbs, to pick and to put together. It is a profound skill critical to the accomplishment of the tea person. No objects are selected solely for their beauty. They are chosen as much for their functional suitability as their beauty. Their function is twofold. Firstly, to serve perfectly as a utensil, and secondly, to act as a part of an assemblage which creates the best environment to welcome the guests. Individual and personal, toriawase is also a strict and profound practice, whereby one's personal attachments and ambitions are set aside for the sake of others. It is a perfect reflection of what we would call the design process. Concern for others takes central place in the design process of toriawase. Objects are not just perfectly placed in space next to each other, they are selected according to the form of the human body. in terms of shape and placement while acknowledging the occasion and the particular guest. The perfection of symmetry is intentionally avoided to open a possibility of combining different materials and forms to make the assemblage more human or more wabi. In the record of Chowando, wabi is linked to the world of human beings, all different and yet all coexisting at the same time. One may find comfort and ease in the company of seemingly imperfect and asymmetrical objects. Moreover, this quality allows the objects to further evolve over the hours of the formal tea gathering. They become living art. Kent Bloomer and Charles Moore, in their preface to Body, Memory and Architecture, comment that in the course of their research they found that reference was seldom made to the unique perceptual and emotional capacities of the human beings, whereas design in Chanyu is a response to human awareness and sensory capacity through the purposeful simulation of all the senses. We can call this sensorial design. A single tatami mat, 1 meter by 2 meters, used as flooring in traditional Japanese structures, can be considered a base, essential element of all Japanese design. Kimura Soshin connects tatami to the structure of a human body, likening the rectangular mat to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian man's circle and square. In tea, creation starts with a single tatami mat for displaying objects placed according to the human anatomy. Then other mats are placed, and lastly, the walls are built around. Tea houses are designed from inside out rather than from the outside in, like most Western buildings, which start by creating a shell and then dividing it inside and then placing people in it. Most tea houses don't look very interesting from the outside. One has to actually be inside, seated on the tatami, to appreciate the space and enjoy their beauty. Moreover, one actually has to linger for hours having tea therein to realize fully their unexpectedly perfect design. The 4 principles of tea practice are harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Harmony is revealed in the relationship between people, nature, and objects. Respect is shown towards people, objects, and space. Purity, both physical and spiritual, is achieved through cleansing and purification. Tranquility, the integrated awareness of body and mind, is attained through this practice. Dr. David Smith cites German philosopher Max Scheler, who criticized the history of Western civilization as an endless journey outwards, with consequent evacuation of the inner life, and the loss of concern for human life as it is lived in its detail. The practice of Chanyu compensates for this evacuation by accentuating concern for human life as it is lived by focusing attention to its detail both within and without the tea house. Japanese contemplative arts are repositories of spiritual and cultural quiet. They survive and flourish right in the great cities and even in the factories, where employers take pains to train their workers in the appreciation of beauty and the meditative precepts of mental repose by providing masters to teach the traditional arts at the workplace, silencing the storms of one's mind while focusing on simple things in front. By repeating the formulated procedure of making tea can result in an open panoramic awareness to the world within and without. Arguably, a performing art on its own, Chanyu sets the stage for nature and objects and people to coalesce in order to create a happening in a special setting where an unrepeatable cathartic experience can be achieved. An interval or a pause helps to silence the metropolis while still being fully present in it. Even while being in the city, doing tea is supposed to feel like being in a small hut on the top of a mountain. A tea space, a mindful corner as I like to call it, can be considered a form of urban sanctuary, an escape from cityscapes. Its importance for the 21st century is undeniable. As the world becomes increasingly technologically developed, spaces, both psychological and physical, that provide and inspire quietude and mindfulness are increasingly important to protect our humanity.
We can begin with Q&A if there's any questions.
Yes, I have two questions for both of you, both Mark and Alexandre. Not the same question for both of you, but two questions. First, for Mark, I'm not quite sure what you mean by post-aesthetics. I mean, I can guess what you mean by post-aesthetics, but I definitely don't agree with that. Because and the question is that how does Audemars theory of anesthetics function in this theory of post-aesthetics? And the second part of my question is more of a comment on your presentation, which I really liked, by the way. I'm not sure if I agree with the fact that this concept of expanded painting changes the ontology. I think it's still, it just changes the canvas, but it doesn't go out of the canvas. So basically, I'm not sure if we're still in the same, I would say that we're still in the same place as we were with installations, in, for example, Duchamp's installation, where the ontology doesn't change, it's just the function that's different. It's extremely evident in, for example, the works by Gross, which you showed, where she could as well done that on the canvas, right? She just chose to have a different canvas, being a wall or a building or a house. But I'm not quite sure if that has to do anything with ontology. And my question for Alexandre is, because I've always wanted to know about this, especially in the context.
Those questions first, because I might forget by the time you've asked the Could I answer your questions first, and then you ask Alexandre?
Oh, okay.
So, I might do it in reverse and talk about the different ontology that expanded painting has. And I think it has to do with all of our formal expectations as to what a painting should be. And it's usually in relationship to a certain flatness, a certain relationship to the window, where we look at a painting and imagine we're viewing a scene in another situation, whether it be representation or abstract. And together with that particular mode of being and mode of production that goes with the history of painting, probably the last 500 years, we expect painting to take a certain physical form and have a certain language that we talk about it, that we're well practiced in, that we're used to talk about almost our entire life, that kind of well-known aesthetic language of beauty and pleasure and good form and so forth. So what's signalled by, I think, by the changes in painting that happened with Cubist constructions and Duchamp's ready-made, and that reached their pinnacle, I think, in the last 20 years or so, with works that are impossible to tell at times whether they are paintings or not. The most common feeling for me is walking into a gallery where I know someone has trained as a painter or been a painter, and there are things everywhere, and the question for me and most people is, where is the painting? So the painting in its expected form and its flatness and its hanging on the wall and its relationship to traditional material and skills is no longer present. But what we tend to have is a painting practice that now interfaces with every other discipline. And it seems, in terms of field thinking, that actually all disciplines exist in a field-like mode of relationships with all other disciplines. So it becomes really hard to differentiate between not only expanded painting, but expanded sculpture, expanded photography, video installation, and so on. They all, conceptual architecture, they all seem to merge on the same space and context. And so I think therein there is a real challenging as to the nature of the being of painting, a challenging as to the way we talk about painting.
Yeah, but that's still physicality. I mean, what you're talking about are shifts in physicality, whilst a shift in ontology for me would be a very fundamental shift in the being of something, like you said. Whilst this is just a shift in formal ways of using something. So it's like saying, I don't know, it's like using a chair for a table. Yeah, okay, but that doesn't change its ontology.
Well, I think it does. I think the nature of being and the nature of things has one element, is its materiality. The way it exists in time is another. The way it exists in the field of relations with other disciplines and human beings and so on is part of all of that discussion about an ontology and about the nature of contemporary expanded painting now. And sorry, the second part of your question was...
post-aesthetics.
Post-aesthetics. What's post-aesthetics? For me, that goes hand in hand with that in that post-aesthetics, I don't know anything about anesthetics and the thinker you mentioned, but the way I think about post-aesthetics is a fairly general cultural trend in the 20th century to get beyond the subject. At a certain point, the individuality of the subject begins to be a kind of trap. It begins to be a kind of a dead end for thinking and a dead end for politics in many ways. So what happens with a lot of people like Heidegger and phenomenology and thinkers outside of the area of psychology is that people begin to look for what comes after the subject. And Heidegger came up with the term Dasein, an attempt to be able to talk about human being without ever having to use that word, the subject or subjectivity. And it turns out, if you have a closer look at subjectivity, that the discipline of aesthetics goes hand in hand with the rise of the notion of the individual subject. And the individual subject has a history, is historical. There hasn't always been subjects and subjectivity. If we look back in the past, groups and clans were far stronger than any idea of individuals. So it seems possible in our era, and it has been struggled for quite some time, to move beyond an historical notion of the subject who moves through the world making aesthetic judgments in every sense of every moment of the day, which reinforces this kind of almost alienated notion of being individual. So post-aesthetics is about actually shifting back to the object, the materiality of a thing, rather than the so-called aesthetic powers of an individual. And what comes from the other side, that phenomenological interest in the return to the thing, is that the thing, the object, the material, the earth itself has a lot to say before the subject can even think and speak. And rather than the subject trying to kind of evoke their own connoisseurial skills or intellectual abilities to say, I like this and not that, but there's work to be done in terms of understanding what objects and materials have to say and how they affect our relationship to them, which is the most important thing in our world today, where we see a world of environmental degradation because we've lost an important connection to the materiality of things and become more and more concerned with our subjective individuality and what pleases us.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. So my second question is to Alexandre, because this, of course, is a question that is important for me, because Roland Barthes, while writing The Empire of Senses, he wrote about a different ritual, Japanese ritual, which really interests me, beside the tea drinking, which was excellently done by you and described, the ikebana, and how this arranging of flowers is different in Japanese culture, where they do not arrange flowers, but they arrange emptiness between the flowers. And this is a totally different way of perceiving an object, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Well, what you're talking about is actually an aesthetic concept that moves through all contemplative arts, including the flower arrangement of Ikebana as well. And this is when we speak about, let's say, Japanese art or Asian art as, well, let's say Japanese art as asymmetric. But for them it is symmetric because they consider the spaces in between, rather than the actual number, for example, of branches or main elements in the flower arrangement, which are 3, but actually we will have it symmetrical because there are only 2 spaces between. The tea, I actually had absolutely no time to describe what happens during 4 hours of tea. Unfortunately, it's just all here, it just couldn't be included. However,
is it included in your paper?
Yes, it is. Yes, and I spent a lot of time writing it in English. It's a description of tea that really took a long, it's a labor, because all the words are worked out in Japanese and they do not exist in English. However, when you asked about Ikebana and what I particularly like or enjoy about tea, or why I think tea, why I chose tea, is because in tea you don't have to choose anything. You can do everything. And it includes everything and puts it together. Ikebana and tea developed at the same time. In fact, the word tea is completely wrong and shouldn't be used. Actually, the word tea is okay. Tea ceremony is completely wrong because in Japanese it started from the word chanoyu. Chanoyu actually literally means hot water for tea. And that's all it means. There's no word ceremony. And in Russian, for example, ceremony has one connotation. In English, it's completely different, and it becomes very difficult to explain, and of course better to experience. And tea also includes flowers. Different from Ikebana, they are called chaban, flowers for tea. And those are the ones that are just not arranged at all. They're placed, they're found. They're seen, found. Like you said, you have to place flowers and tea with your feet, which means you have to walk around it, and you have to find that flower, see it, find it, and bring it inside the tea room, and then it becomes that one element that will, draw the heart of your guest, etc., etc. So in Ikebana, flowers are used as a material to create a different form, when in tea it's being sort of composed on a very different principle. I don't know if I answered your question. I ran away.
Thank you. To Mark, please. I'd like to continue the debate, shall we say, on post-aesthetics. Whilst you were doing your presentation, it seemed to me that you were arguing that post-aesthetics was a move where it used to be an elitist thing, and because it's now a more collective social thing, it cannot be defined as aesthetics. It seems to me, however, and perhaps even using or interpreting the images that you've shown us, that it was merely a change in the trends, or in what can be defined as aesthetic, in the sense that it pleases people. So I'm interested in this idea that I would argue it is still aesthetics, regardless of whether it's an elite that makes the definition of what is aesthetically pleasing, or a larger collective of people. And then in the answer you gave to Radek's question, you start talking about subjectivity, and I think of the question that you asked to an earlier presentation, in which you said that an image should be maybe described using theories and not individual interpretation. So could you maybe weave that into another expanded answer on what is post-aesthetics? for those of us that are maybe a bit sceptical.
Sure. Thank you. So I think aesthetics as a word was once upon a time associated with the connoisseur, who would have been someone who was finely educated in an area and could make very specific educated decisions. But part of the argument I'm making is that at a certain point, aesthetics becomes all of our ways of life. So there's nothing elitist about it at all. We are all aestheticians every day. We're all making aesthetic decisions about what's good and bad and what's pleasing us. And what I'm trying to get at in terms of post-aesthetics is to keep a little bit of what aesthetics had. It was about making judgments. But rather than making judgments that were based on my personal individual pleasure, it becomes a judgment about what is ontologically good or bad. So post-aesthetics then begins to merge with ontological aesthetics. In fact, probably ontological aesthetics is a more accurate term, but it's heavy and overloaded. So I find it easier to begin off with the word post-aesthetics, signifying an effort to get beyond what we've traditionally understood as the aesthetic discipline. So once we get to ontological aesthetics, I'm saying, well, aesthetics was this system where we made judgments about the beautiful and the pleasurable. And I want to drop those words, beauty and pleasure, but keep some notion of making judgments about what's ontologically good and bad. And that then requires a whole lot of work around, well, ontological aesthetics is then the decision as to whether an artwork is doing good work. What work does an artwork do as a work of art? Is it actually revealing the world in all its complexity and the complicated notions of the world we live in now, which seems to be characterized by environmental issues and financial issues? So does a work of art actually pull something out from the background and reveal some kind of truth to us, or is it merely caught up in an ontological bad situation where it merely allows those situations to go on as they are? I haven't quite worked that one out. I'm in the process of doing that, and I think there's lots of good work to be done in that area. I've done a bit of writing on it, and I see other people are doing it, and I'm borrowing from lots of different places. And to get to the final part of your question, it actually wasn't a criticism of the way... Sorry, how do you say your name?
Radek.
Radek. I was actually... When Radek spoke in those passionate terms about the González-Torres work, I came out of my normal conference mode and noticed all these flavours and tones and personal passion. I also like a theoretical attitude as well. I just thought I noticed a change in texture, and I wanted to be able to foreground that in some way. It was definitely not a criticism, because in my own writing, I like it when, in an unpredictable way, my passion can come through in the writing without disturbing the theoretical train of events, if you know what I mean. And that's what I thought I experienced, and that's what I wanted to talk about. But it wasn't meant to be that's not a way you should talk about work.
Sorry, there was no implication in my comment.
Yeah.
We were criticising the
okay.
presentation. Anyway, thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
I hope it's not going to be a ping pong thing now. So it happens in this sort of situation.
So basically, this returning to the post-aesthetic thing. So basically, this concept of post-aesthetics is a return to very fundamental aesthetics derived from Plato, who distinguished aestheses as the way to know things through the senses, contrary to doxa, which was intellectual knowledge. Am I getting you right? Because you speak a lot about axiology and judgment, but